Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition here of Point of View, and over the next couple hours, going to really have a chance to talk with a number of distinguished guests. In just a minute, we'll be talking with our friend, Representative Jeff Leach, and we'll talk about what is happening in the legislature, including a piece of legislation that he's putting forward that I think you will really appreciate. Next hour, we have Professor Robert George, who is a professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University, also the head of the James Madison Program on American Ideals and Institutions. We'll be talking about some of the things he's done with Professor Cornel West, and I think you will appreciate that conversation. And if that's not enough, in the 2 o'clock hour, we have Rachel Bovard with us. She's been in studio with us before. She had a piece that came out in USA Today having to do with the whole issue of big tech. And I might just mention that my commentary yesterday was about big tech and the possibility of reining that in through Section 230, which I think is unlikely. My commentary today is about the purge that seems to be taking place in big tech. We'll be talking about that with her in terms of Parler and the future. And in between, of course, we have another impeachment trial coming up, and we have some other questions that are being raised about vaccine distribution, which I will get to later this hour, as well as the impact of some of these executive orders that have been signed by President Biden and the impact that's going to have on our society. So we have lots to talk about, and we will certainly do so. But let's start out, first of all, with our friend, Representative Jeff Leach. He represents the citizens of House District 67, serves as the vice chairman of the House Committee on Urban Affairs, also a member of the House Committee on Economic and Small Business, individual that graduated from Baylor University and earned his law degree from Southern Methodist University, and we are just delighted to bring him back to the program. Jeff, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, great to be with you, my friend, as always.
You know, I was just thinking, we have seen this pandemic. We've seen some of these lockdowns, and wouldn't it be good to maybe, like, I don't know, have a constitutional amendment that could actually establish that churches are essential and that we couldn't close them down? And I think that's exactly what you're talking about these days.
Well, I wish such a constitutional amendment wasn't needed. And in fact, we swear an oath as public officials to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the laws of the United States and of the state of Texas. As you know, as your listeners know, the First Amendment guarantees our right to assemble, our freedom of religion, the right to worship. And you would hope that our government officials at all levels would respect and safeguard those rights. Unfortunately, as we've seen in states like California and New York, and in many other instances across the country, we see elected officials at all levels, whether it's mayors or governors or county judges, actually going out of their way to assault that freedom. And so here in Texas, we're going to fight back. We're going to speak out and stand up and draw a line in the sand and put belts and suspenders on. So we have filed a constitutional amendment here in Texas called the Texas Essential Church Act, filed it yesterday, and it will protect our churches from ever in the future being closed down or limited from congregating, worshiping, or serving their communities.
Let me just mention that, first of all, we have a link, of course, to the website for Jeff Leach. We also have information about that press release, so you can see that as well, because this is one we're hoping that you will get behind. And, of course, in the House, it's House Joint Resolution 72, but also the state Senator Kelly Hancock in Tarrant County has filed Senate Joint Resolution 26. 67. So if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about this, I'd like to promote this, maybe put something on Facebook, Twitter, maybe have some people speak to that, maybe get your own legislator to sign on as a co-sponsor. Those are some resources we have posted there. And I might just say for some of our listeners, I know that this first hour from 12 to 1, primarily we have a Texas audience, and then of course we have our national hour from 1 to 3. But some of you may not be in the state of Texas, and let me just encourage you to find out more about this, because this is the same kind of piece of legislation that you could have your legislator file in your particular state legislature, and that would be a great opportunity. And what you have said today when it came out, or yesterday, was you said the vast majority of Texans are people of faith, actively practicing their faith through membership and participation in local churches, synagogues, mosques, and houses of worship. And yet you've seen the closing down. And in Texas, maybe not as bad as what we've talked about on Fridays with Kelly Shackelford, when he's actually filed cases from Kentucky to California. But in some respects, nobody really anticipated the need for this, Jeff Leach, because we never really thought that you would have mayors, governors, even county judges saying that you would have to close down a house of worship. And so that's why you're actually pushing this forward. So what is the prospect for the future in this particular piece of legislation?
Well, we feel real positive about it. We're going to need 2/3 of the House and the Senate, so it's going to need to be, and we're confident that it will be a bipartisan bill. And then the people of Texas will get to vote on it in a statewide referendum in November. And Kerby, I want to mention two quick things. You're so right, and I'm glad you mentioned people who may live in other states, freedom-loving Americans who might be in Ohio or Indiana or Florida or California and listen to your show. I know you've got a broad listening audience really all over the world. And yes, please contact us. So the states are laboratories of democracy, and it's important for us to be on the lookout for what other states, other counterparts in other states are doing. As an example, last session I filed and passed the Texas Born Alive Infant Protection Act, a really strong piece of pro-life legislation at the state level. And we've had other state legislators call us and ask for us to help them in their states pass those bills. So it's important for freedom-loving Americans, especially people of faith, Kerby, as you mentioned, to step out and not just to follow what's happening in Washington, but to get involved in their state capitals, in their school boards, in their city councils, their county commissioners, their courthouses, and to take the church house to the state house and the courthouse.
And again, after we come back from the break, we do want to talk a little bit about, of course, one of the constitutionally mandated things for the Texas legislature and for legislatures in other parts of the country is to have a balanced budget. And Comptroller Glenn Hager said, well, you've got $1 billion shortfall, but I still see some of these baseline budgets looking like the possibility we won't have to raid the rainy day fund or increase taxes. And then, of course, you have reapportionment. But just before we take a break, let me just come back to one more point, because this, as you said, requires 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then this Texas Essential Church Act would, in order to be part of the Constitution, would go to a statewide referendum, and that would be November 2021. So I suspect you want to enlist as many listeners as possible to, first of all, encourage the legislature to pass this, and then to go out there and educate their fellow Texas citizens to actually ratify that in November. That's right. I want to encourage your listeners to be in touch with their legislators, let them know that they support this. And I do want to reiterate that yes, the vast majority of people of faith in Texas are in Christian churches, but this also applies to people of every faith. Yes. We need to make sure that whether you go to a Southern Baptist church, a Catholic church, a synagogue, or a mosque, that you realize that this bill is meant to protect your fundamental right to practice your freedom of religion. And so, yes, encourage your listeners to be in touch with their legislators and help us get this on the ballot in November. Again, a point of view, 3 cheers for Jeff Leach and Kelly Hancock and many others that will be co-sponsoring this as well. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of the issues before the Texas legislature, and there are many. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Will censorship increase, or is the purge of some politicians' political content over? A few argue that now that President Trump is history, and now that a few malcontents have been removed from social media, our leaders can get back to governing. But there are too many voices who seem emboldened by the purges that have taken place. For example, the CEO of Mozilla argued that deplatforming people from its services was not enough. He believes that real change requires more than just the temporary silencing or permanent removal of bad actors. On a recent CNN program, a former Facebook officer called for carriers like Verizon, AT&T, and others to deplatform One American News Network and Newsmax. At Forbes, the chief content officer warned companies that might consider hiring somebody who worked in the Trump administration because he said Forbes will assume that everything your company or firm talks about is a lie. Another editor at Forbes warned that there would be a truth reckoning for such companies. Alfredo Ortiz, writing in Real Clear Politics, believes that big tech's coordinated silencing of conservative voices, including President Trump's, signals a crossing of the Rubicon in the debate over government involvement to protect free speech. Although those involved in this purge justify it as a way to prevent further rioting and violence, he believes it is a power grab. Even the ACLU warns it should concern everyone when companies like Facebook and Twitter wield the unchecked power to remove people from platforms that have become indispensable for the speech of billions. It seems to me that a purge has begun. It doesn't seem to me that it will stop anytime soon. Who will it destroy and when will it stop? Nobody really knows. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for just a few more minutes Representative Jeff Leach, representing the 67th House District. If you'd like to ask a question, 1-800-351-1212. Just sit back and listen to some of the conversation, and we could go on for some time, but let me focus on a few, Jeff, and one of those is, of course, the constitutionally mandated requirement of balancing a budget. And I've seen, just briefly, the House and Senate base budgets, which encourage me because when you've heard the comptroller the other day say we have $1 billion shortfall, you wonder, okay, how are we going to balance all of this? Of course, this is before they put all the different ornaments on the Christmas tree, as I say, but nevertheless, that's one of the big challenges that face both you in the House and the Senate right now. True?
Yeah, no, absolutely true. We take our responsibility, our constitutional responsibility to pass a balanced budget very seriously, to not spend the taxpayer dollars, so to speak, but to faithfully steward the taxpayer dollars. That's what we're called to do or elected to do. You know, we are facing about $1 billion budget shortfall, but Kerby, after the last 8 months we've had, really the past year, the pandemic and the crisis that's been caused by COVID-19, the economic crisis, a $1 billion shortfall is actually something that we can celebrate in Texas. Many states are facing several billion-dollar budget shortfalls, and we're going to be able to pass a balanced budget, protect taxpayers from tax increases or increases on their fees, and fund the priorities of the state in an efficient and effective way this session.
The Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, said this is not the first time Texas has seen difficult economic times. We're committed to maintaining our fiscal integrity using the conservative budget principles that will ensure Texas remains a job-creating engine for the nation and a major player in the global marketplace. Your new Speaker of the House also said that these decisions will have a lasting impact on the future of our state, and again, seems to be dedicated to improving our business climate, economic prosperity, and the rest. And you're well aware, Jeff Leach, I know that there are a lot of people that have been moving from some of those other states, oftentimes blue states, into the state of Texas. And so in some respects, they're doing so because you've created a positive and vibrant business climate right now here in this state.
They're coming to Texas because we value freedom. We respect the rule of law, the Constitution. We want people to be free to raise their families, educate their kids, run their businesses the way they best see fit. Let me tell you, I've been in this business long enough. I'm now in my 5th term, and I'm more convinced than ever that it's the people that have the power, not the politicians. And that's why people are moving here. From Texas, from other states that are broken, and many situations may be beyond repair. We welcome them here. We're going to continue to make sure Texas is open for business and open for people that want to move here. And what's been really great is Republicans, conservatives keep winning here, and so we welcome people here. We're going to continue to do the right things and message it the right way and serve people, which is what we're elected to do. And we're confident that Texas will remain the envy of the nation.
By the way, speaking of elected, again, congratulations on you being reelected. But let's talk about elections for just a minute, because there were some people in like Harris County and others that thought that they might just violate some of the rules having to do with elections. And when we look nationwide, Jeff, as you well know, there are a lot of individuals, not just Republicans, but also independents and some Democrats that are saying we aren't so convinced that the election rules that have been in place for some time in some of the states have been faithfully followed. We've had less of that in the state of Texas, but I do know that there have been some bills filed to address some of these, how we say it, election irregularities. What about that?
There's no question about it. And, this ought to be a discussion that Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals shouldn't just be willing to have, but I believe on a regular basis, Kirby, should be eager to have. Because the preservation and the protection of the integrity of our elections is foundational and fundamental and vital for the preservation of our democracy. And if there's one instance of voter fraud, one example of voting irregularities is one too many. And we've got to constantly be faithful and vigilant in our roles as public servants to ask tough questions, to have meaningful conversations and deliberations. And when we see problems in the system, holes that we can fill or problems that need to be fixed, we ought to be willing to do that. We're going to do it here in the state of Texas. My hope is that in other states, as they deal with their elections, specifically states like Georgia and Pennsylvania and others, that they'll be willing and courageous to do the same thing.
One other thing that I thought I at least would mention before we run out of time is that we just had the census, and so every 10 years, that then requires the state legislatures, and this would be the state of Texas as well as all the other states, to redraw districts, picking up 3 congressional representatives as well as redrawing the particular areas for the 150 members of the Texas House, the 31 members of the Texas Senate, as well as school board and all sorts of other issues. And that is important. And then you have to deal with all the other regulations, the court challenges, and all the rest. We've had Representative Phil King on the program in the past talking about the challenge that is there. But that is something else that needs to take place in this session, and it always tends to be fairly controversial.
So we've got 2 constitutional responsibilities. You talked about one of them, the budget. The other one is redistricting. And I serve on the Texas House Redistricting Committee, chaired by Phil King, a great fellow man of faith, a great legislator, strong conservative. And look, we're going to draw maps. We're going to do so in a fair, constitutional, and transparent way to make sure, Kirby, and this is real important, that the voters are choosing their representatives, not that the representatives are choosing their voters, if that makes sense. That's a really important fundamental constitutional principle, and we're going to do the right thing here in Texas.
Let's, if we can, help people get connected with you. And first of all, we've put up Senate Joint Resolution 27 and House Joint Resolution 72 from Legal Scan, so people can read about that and track it and all of the rest, and so they can find that information. Also, they can click on your picture, and that will take you to jeffleach.com. And so if people want to know more about how to maybe push forward that particular piece of legislation, or maybe they have questions about redistricting or about the issue of gun control and Second Amendment rights, or certainly some of the concerns they have about the budget or taxes or property tax relief or education, which is, of course, one of the most significant parts of that budget. And I know you come from a family of educators, so you certainly can speak to those issues. What can they find when they land on your website? Because I know there were a number of people that would probably like to communicate with you, and how can they do so?
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me on today. I do want to direct your listeners, if they're interested to learn more, or importantly, if they want to communicate with me, if they want to share their ideas, their concerns, ask me questions, go to my website, jeffleach.com. The most important thing you'll find there, if you click on the Contact Jeff tab or Connect with Jeff, my cell phone number's there, the very phone I'm talking to you on right now. If people want to call me, my cell phone's been available for my constituents and for all the people since day one when I first started to run. The best ideas, the best solutions, the best conversations come from the people I'm elected to serve. So whether they live in my district or not, I invite them to contact me if there's any way I can serve them.
And again, I would encourage you to go to some of the news and information on jeffleach.com, but we've also given you a link to this particular piece of legislation. And I'm going to give you a homework assignment. It seems to me that most of you listening to this program would certainly think that churches are essential, and you would certainly support an idea like the Texas Essential Church Act. So take the time to, first of all, find out about it, read it, pass it on to your legislator, and start educating your fellow citizens, because I am going to be willing to step out on a limb and say, I'm pretty sure they're going to get 2/3 of the House and Senate to actually endorse this. And then we have a statewide referendum that will take place. You might as well mark this on your calendar, November 2nd, 2021. So Jeff Leach, thank you for standing for all of these issues of faith, family, and freedom. And thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Kirby, thank you. I seriously just want to thank you, my friend. This is a country and a state worth fighting for. Our values are worth fighting for, and I'm proud to be locking arms with you, man. You're making a difference, and I thank all your listeners as well.
Well, again, Jeff Leach has been with us. We've talked about some of this before. Of course, Kelly Shackelford sometimes joins us on Friday. We've talked about that. Jonathan Saenz will be with us on a pretty regular basis, and I would imagine at least one of the issues that they want to push through the legislature will be this Texas Essential Church Act. And again, the sponsor in the House is Jeff Leach. That's HJR 72. In the Senate, that would be Kelly Hancock. That would be SJR 27. And, of course, I just mentioned those two individuals. I'm quite aware of the fact that Matt Shaheen, I think, had a piece of legislation as well. I'm almost sure that most of the people we've had on this program, whether it's Matt Krause, whether it's Candy Noble, or a variety of others, probably have already signed on with that. And, of course, in the Senate, Angela Paxton and a number of others. But it's worth you finding out who agrees with and has already sponsored this particular act. And then, if indeed that is passed both by the House and the Senate, and I would hope that it would be, then you've got another task, and that is to educate your fellow citizens who will go out and vote November 2nd, 2021. And so I just wanted you to know about that. It was filed yesterday, and you heard about it first here on Point of View. You know, that's kind of what we do here on Point of View, educate you about some issues you probably haven't heard about. Okay, we got to come back and talk about an impeachment. We're going to talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, Make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. Don't forget that in about a half an hour, we're going to have Professor Robert George. What a privilege to have him with us. Talk about the dialogue he has with Cornel West, and it gets back to the issue of a civil dialogue, and also an individual that I have just such high respect for because of his work over the years on the pro-life movement and his work on human rights and all sorts of different issues. And then Rachel Bovard will be with us at 2 o'clock. I will get to the impeachment in a moment, but let me give you a preview. I also want to spend some time talking about vaccine distribution. We are starting to see what happens when sometimes a bureaucracy starts taking over. And as a result, you see there's some real failures in actually getting the vaccine into the arms of individuals. I recognize, okay, some people don't want to take it. That's fine. But that's not the problem right now. We have people looking for maybe the golden ticket, if I'm referring to that a little bit to try to get that. Of course, I'm meeting more and more individuals that have had the vaccine. I've met a number that have had both doses of the vaccine. But a lot of them are like Willy Wonka looking for that golden ticket. So what's going on? And I do want to get into that, especially. This is a Texas story. An individual in Houston, doctor recognizes that we no longer have anybody else we can inject the vaccine with, but we don't want to throw this vial out. So he uses tremendous innovation, gets on his phone, tries to figure out if there are some other people who hadn't come in that day who were eligible to get vaccinated, and does that, and then gets in trouble from the bureaucracy. So I do want to talk about that for just a minute because it shows this. And of course, somebody has been pointing out as well just the fact that we're not getting many vaccines into the arms of individuals on Sunday. And so somebody jokingly said, who's running this, Chick-fil-A? And then he jokingly said, well, actually, if Chick-fil-A were running this, we probably would have long lines, but they'd be moving really quickly. So we're going to get into some of the issue of the vaccine and the distribution problems, including when you have the head of the CDC who says, we have no idea how many vaccines there are. We have any idea of where they went, and we have no idea how many people have been served. You are kidding me. No, I'm not. I just was put in by the Biden transition team, interestingly enough, back in December, because you didn't have to have actual central approval. And she's brilliant from Harvard Medical School. But again, you really don't know this. I mean, I can pretty much tell you if I order something from Amazon where my package is, any place during the day. I can tell you whether it's been delivered and even pull up on my camera a picture of the fact you've delivered it to my house. And you cannot tell me when we have Pfizer and Moderna, which are the only two right now, that we can't, even at Pfizer and Moderna, know how many vaccines we've produced? You've got to be kidding me. Apparently not. So that's just a preview of what we'll get to in just a few minutes, which, again, you can blame the Trump administration. After about a couple of weeks, I don't think you can blame the Trump administration any longer. And right now, it just illustrates, again, just kind of the bureaucratic drag that takes place in any situation. And it's something to just pay attention to. And we will talk about that in just a few minutes. But we do have another impeachment. And the impeachment vote took place, of course, in the House. Now, the article of impeachment has been delivered to the Senate. It will take place next month. But nevertheless, as the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal put it, Democrats just simply can't let go of Donald Trump, even as a former president. So, of course, the House managers walk their articles of impeachment over to the Senate for trial, and their goal is to banish Mr. Trump from running for office again. But they say the reality is that it will probably be an acquittal, because, after all, you've got to get not only all the Democrats voting for what looks now almost like a sham impeachment, and I'll explain why some people are calling it that in just a minute, but also you have to pick up not only all 50 Democrats, you have to pick up at least 17 Republicans. Do you have that many? We'll see. And again, this is going to be the difficulty because you need, of course, 2/3 in that regard. Some people say it's not constitutional, as evidenced by the fact that, first of all, this was done in the House without any attempt to provide a defense of the president. It was simply rushed through. And so your ability to actually before your accusers and to offer a defense simply did not take place. And so that is a big issue, first of all, because after all, this idea that you should at least have some chance to have an opportunity to provide a defense, and that was not, may be reason enough to actually set this aside. But it's also illustrated by something else. I have in front of me here a United States Constitution. You can pull out your United States Constitution and look at Article 1, Section 3, and you'll see that a true impeachment and removal from office, taking both elements of that, require it to be actually convened by the Chief Justice of the United States. And we just heard that the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, will not be actually presiding over this. Well, then who will? Well, Senator Pat Leahy will be doing that. And that already shows you that it's not a constitutional impeachment trial. And so you can go all the way down the list. But let's take one other very obvious thing, and that is impeachment was intended to remove a person from office, whether the president, the vice president, the Supreme Court justice, whoever it might be. And the argument is that since he is not actually presiding, that is Chief Justice, over this, that is the case. And also, since it will be done for an individual that is no longer in office, it also seems to be very difficult to justify. This is the best I can find. If you go back to, this is amazing, 1876, there was an attempt by the British, interestingly enough, to actually impeach Warren Hastings for his malfeasance as a governor general of Bengal. And there was an attempt in, well, that was earlier, I might mention, and then there was an attempt in the U.S. Senate in 1876 to actually hold a trial of a former war secretary after he was impeached and resigned. But again, in that particular case, either in your legal precedent, which is Britain, and you don't necessarily want to use British common law to actually be interpreting the Constitution. And if you look at the case in the United States Senate in 1876, that was almost immediately set aside because many of the sitting senators at the time thought that the whole issue of a trial after a resignation was unconstitutional. So there are really solid, if you will, constitutional and legal grounds for saying that this is a sham impeachment. But nevertheless, we will see what happens in the United States Senate next month. That will be something we will cover later. It probably didn't even deserve that many minutes of attention, but I want to get into the whole issue of the vaccine. You now have the head of the CDC, and that's Rochelle Walensky, who was put in that position last month by the Biden transition team. Don't you love how they do this sometimes? It seems to me that you wouldn't be able to do that till January 20th, but that's fine. I'm not going to argue about that. But nevertheless, she claims that the federal government does not know how many doses of coronavirus vaccine have been given at any moment in time. I gave you rough percentages yesterday and said, okay, good news for North Dakota and West Virginia, bad news for California and Alabama, and everybody else is in between. But again, I love this when she said, if we don't really know how many vaccines they're getting just this week or next week, then, of course, the states can't plan. And again, I just got a question. I mean, maybe I'm just not asking the right questions, but let's face it. We've got two companies that are manufacturing the vaccine. Isn't there at least one person at Moderna and at least one person at Pfizer who knows how many doses the company has manufactured? That would at least be a start, wouldn't you think? And you'd think they'd at least have some ballpark figures for that number. And again, almost every other company in the world that has any kind of digital place, they have UPC codes, they have radio frequency identification chips. We supposedly have those chips on these boxes that are being sent out, which has caused some people to think the chips are actually in the vaccine. No, they're not. And so then you have, I'll just leave with this one before we take a break, the governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo, who has announced that the state has run out of vaccines. But if you look at the chart, the Bloomberg chart, it says that New York has only used 61% of its nearly 2.4 million allocated doses. So who's right? I don't have a clue. And this is, as we like to say sometimes, no way to run a railroad. But that's what's going on right now with the vaccine. When we come back, I want to get into some other issues, because if indeed this is urgent, I think most of us think it is, then shouldn't we actually insert the vaccine into people's arms 7 days a week, not 6 days a week, and take Sunday off? I recognize that some of these healthcare workers are overworked, but I want to get into that issue because it also illustrates just another one of the problems with some of this vaccine distribution. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just again mention that at the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with Professor Robert George, and a very good piece that we've also posted. To unite the country, we need honesty and courage, and it was co-authored by both Robert George, who will be with us, and Cornel West. Two very different individuals, both politically, ethnically, racially, even in terms of some of their social perspectives. I mean, they do have a little bit in common. Both of them have actually taken classes both at Harvard and Princeton. Cornel West, I think he's at Harvard Divinity School now, and Robert George went to Harvard, both the law school and divinity school, and Cornel West was at undergraduate at Princeton. So they have one thing in common, and that's academic background, but very little else. And it's, I think, encouraging to have two individuals coming together and helping show how we can have a civil dialogue and have civility. So we'll talk about that. Let me just mention that some of the articles I've posted, I really wanted to wait till the national hour to talk about the impact of some of these economic policies that have been implemented through executive orders, what that's going to mean. Our good friend Matt Walsh talks about, well, does return to normalcy mean that under Biden we now force girls to share bathrooms with boys? Very good piece by him. And before we're all through, we'll probably talk about H.R. 1 and a very good piece by Mike Huckabee on what he calls it the Democracy Destruction Act of 2021. So I just wanted you to know about some of those pieces of legislation that are coming down. But let's come back to the vaccines, because part of this has a Texas angle, and I thought it would be good. But first of all, we're starting to see that we're not necessarily getting these vaccinations 7 days a week. Okay, right off the bat, I recognize some of the people in the medical field, they're exhausted, they're burned out. And in some respects, you may want to get other individuals, but there are a lot of people in this world that can give a vaccination. It's not that complicated. And so you could hire other people, bring in other people that haven't been working in emergency rooms and hospitals and things of that nature. And so if you look at this, America basically vaccinates, well, she's this last couple of weeks here. In Saturday, they vaccinated 795,000 people. On Sunday, 44,000 people. Do you see a difference there? 795,000 people vaccinated on Saturday, only 44,000 on Sunday, which of course led some wags to say, well, who's running this? Chick-fil-A? And actually, I think it's a good line, because our good friends at Chick-fil-A would say, you know what, if we had Chick-fil-A running this thing, yeah, maybe it'd have long lines, but they'd be moving pretty quickly, and they would be off the charts cheery. They'd be doing all sorts of things. So anyway, I just thought it was a great line, and I had to drop it in there. But it gets us into some other issues, and that is, when you get a vial, they're first of all finding that they can actually get more vaccinations out of some of these vials than they originally thought. I've seen this somewhere. I don't think I have it right here, but somebody was saying how you could maybe get an extra couple of doses, and that's really encouraging, because that means that it goes longer. But there was a problem in Houston, and the problem simply was this. In Harris County, a judge finally decided to dismiss a case against a doctor who was accused at the time of stealing doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. It was a Moderna one. Dr. Hassan Gokal, I heard about this last night, and I thought I wanted to cover it because it just is a good illustration of how sometimes the bureaucracy does things that aren't in the best interest of the public. And that is, he was fired because he was allegedly swiping a vial of the vaccine. But that's not what happened at all. If you've actually read the story, he was actually putting vaccines into people. And then at the very end, he'd, of course, punctured a new vial of vaccine. And the day was winding down. And all of a sudden, he realized that I have this vial full of vaccine, and the requirement is that you turn it back in. And he was, I think, initiating enough and maybe smart enough and a bit of an entrepreneur, if you will, to simply say, wait a minute, I mean, we hate for this just get thrown out. So he gets on his phone, as I understand, and calls some individuals that he knew would actually have qualified for getting the vaccine. They come in, he vaccinates them, and those are about 8 people, I believe, after hours. And the very last one, I guess, was to his wife, who had pulmonary sarcoidosis, I think is how you pronounce that. And then, of course, he is now fired and being prosecuted for stealing a vaccine. I want to give him credit, and I'm glad at least the Harris County judge gave him credit for recognizing that just taking the vial and throwing it away when it can save people's lives makes no sense at all. And I think it's just a good illustration of sometimes how the bureaucracy simply doesn't understand how this could be done. Now, should he gotten permission? Yeah, well, if there's somebody there that he could call, that would certainly be a good idea. But sometimes you're the only one standing at the end, and you're saying, rather than just throw it in the garbage, let's see if we can have it do some good for some other individuals. So I applaud him, and I'm also maybe applauding now the Harris County judge that decided not to accuse him and sentence him for stealing a vial when he actually put it to good use. Which brings me to my last point. Those of us that will be watching the Super Bowl, and there may not be as many, will notice that your annual Budweiser Clydesdale commercial will not be there any longer, at least this time. And the reason for it is that Anheuser-Busch has decided that they would devote their time, which used to be a Super Bowl commercial, to actually spending the time to actually encourage people to get the COVID-19 vaccine. They're committing $1 million of ad inventory for what's called vaccine awareness and education. Now, as positive as that might be, and I'll be the first to admit that there are some, as we've talked about before, that have real hesitancy about actually getting the vaccine, you have to say now you're also finding out that not only is Budweiser, but Wall Street Journal reports that across industries, business leaders are now developing staff meetings and memos and commercials and everything to try to get people to actually get vaccinated. Let's put this in perspective. We haven't been able to get those vaccines in the arms of a lot of individuals, in part because I think of distribution problems. There are people that are what we call octogenarians. Those would be people over 80 that are being told that they won't get actually immunized until mid-March. We have some that are saying they might have to wait till mid-April. There are people that are actually saying that when they actually try to go to websites, the websites crash. When they try to call, the phone lines are always busy in just trying to get an appointment. And as I've said, there is something kind of odd about trying to now have all these public service announcements at a time when, as I said before, it looks like some people are hunting for the golden Willy Wonka ticket just to try to get immunization. That being said, I do think it has been kind of interesting to see the number of those in the medical professions that, even though they're on the front lines, have turned it down. This one particular doctor in Portland, Oregon, a cardiothoracic surgeon, said, I don't think anyone wants to be a guinea pig. So he says, I'm not going to get vaccinated. I want to see the data now and give me full data, which, by the way, we've now had 23 million people so far that have been vaccinated. When you look at the tests, the 3 rounds of tests in this, 23 million have been vaccinated. But nevertheless, this has become such a problem. I'm reading about this now. I guess this is in Oregon. Everything's happening in Oregon these days. As some administrators are now offering free breakfasts at Waffle House, won a raffle for a car to get their medical personnel to roll up their sleeves and get vaccinated. You just can't make this stuff up. But nevertheless, I just thought you might want to know, well, where is the vaccine distribution going? Well, it's not going as well as it could. And maybe we can get some people stepping in to do the right thing. Let's take a break. We're going to be spending some time talking with our friend Robert George right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Tuesday edition of Point of View. Over the next couple hours, we're going to be talking with two different guests, and also we'll get into some of the issues in the news. Of course, a second impeachment, and what does that mean? Maybe some of the economic impact of some of these executive orders by President Biden, including maybe the whole issue of transgenderism, what that's going to mean as well, and many other topics we will certainly get into. But first off, I wanted to spend some time chatting with an individual that we have quoted so often here on Point of View, and that is Professor Robert George. As you may or may not know, he has had an ongoing dialogue with Cornel West, and that has been very popular, and we wanted you to know about that. And if you are not familiar with it, we have actually posted a very good piece that was written by the two of them that appeared in the Boston Globe a couple of months ago, entitled "To Unite the Country, We Need Honesty and Courage." So often we talk about civility, the need for a civil dialogue, and I think this is going to be an encouragement to you, and maybe even providing you with a platform to do something similar in your community. Professor Robert George is the professor of jurisprudence at Princeton University, also the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions there at Princeton. In the past has served as the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's also, of course, been somebody we've quoted in terms of human rights, pro-life issues, and much more. Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Swarthmore, holds multiple degrees from Harvard in law and the Divinity School, as well as doctoral degrees and much more from Oxford University. You're probably familiar with some of his books, probably some of the best known, Making Men Moral, of course, The Clash of Orthodoxies, as well as an individual that has spoken so much on the issue of natural law. So, Professor George, it is a delight and a real honor to have you on the program with us today.
Well, the honor's mine, Kerby. Thank you for inviting me on.
Talk about how this developed. I have been familiar with the interaction between you and Cornel West, and for people that are not familiar, yes, you both were at Harvard and Princeton, but bottom line, apart from that similarity in terms of your differences politically, differences racially, differences in terms of style. You are very different kind of individuals, and I think it illustrates that even people that you may have very little in common with and may even disagree with on political issues, you can still have a civil dialogue about, and that's how that developed, isn't it?
Yes, indeed, it is how it developed. I'll talk in a few minutes about the very important things we share, including basic principles that we share. But we certainly have a lot of differences. We're at different places politically. He is the honorary chairman of Democratic Socialists of America. I'm a traditional conservative. I generally support the Republicans in elections. He almost always supports the Democrats. So we're certainly not in the same place. Our relationship began in this way. In the 1990s, when we were both a good deal younger, and our careers were starting out, he was a little ahead of me, and he already had a national reputation when he arrived at Princeton, where I was already teaching. He had been teaching at Union Theological Seminary for several years before that.
Yes.
In any event, we were together in some faculty seminars and discussions, and I noticed that although he would almost always reach conclusions I disagreed with, he was the one guy in the room who was asking the right questions. And I've learned in my 3.5 decades as a scholar, 99% of the battle is getting the right question. You'll never get the right answer unless you get the right question, and getting the right question is very hard. And Cornel West was asking exactly the right question. Most of our colleagues in those discussions, our academic colleagues, were what I call conventional standard academic liberals. Their basic line on political philosophy was that in order to protect freedom, government has to be neutral on issues of moral values. It kind of tends in the directions of a kind of relativism. It's not strictly speaking moral relativism, but it goes in that direction. But Cornel and I, and here's something we shared, we're not there. We didn't share this idea of neutrality as the principle of justice, moral neutrality of government as the principle of justice. Both of us thought it was unavoidable that law and government, that public policy be based on moral values, on sound moral values. Now, we had some disagreements about which ones they were, which the sound ones were, but we were in the same place as against the vast majority of our colleagues who wanted to bracket or prescind from questions of the human good, human dignity, human destiny, human nature. We thought those questions had to be engaged, so we were the ones pushing to engage the questions.
And it seems to me that, again, talking about some of the similarities, you both believed, as far as I can tell, in the idea of equal justice under the law. You believed in really the common good for civilization. You believe that we should speak out against injustice, tyranny, oppression, those kinds of things. So even though you came to different conclusions, you came at it with a set of a kind of shared moral values, I would say.
Well, we are both Christians. We both believe the teaching of Genesis 1, that human beings, though fashioned from the mere dust of the earth, are also made in the very image and likeness of the divine ruler and creator of all that is. So we believe in the inherent dignity and the equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. Now, when we try to apply that principle, sometimes we come out in different places. It takes me to the strict pro-life position. I believe that beginning with the child in the womb, from the earliest developmental stages, we have a creature fashioned in the image and likeness of God, the bearer of profound and inherent dignity. He's not there, at least not yet. You know, he clings to the principle. He'll profess the principle, but he has often said he's not sure whether we really have a human being there yet. Now, to me, that's not a matter of religion. That's just a straightforward matter of science, and it seems to me not debatable, not refutable. The science is very clear that the human embryo is not something different from a human being. It's a human being at a certain very early developmental stage. But we do have that sharing of principles. We also believe that as scholars, we are called not to just be in the classroom or in the library, but out there trying to affect things, change things, make a difference for the society, bring our work and our judgments to bear on issues of public importance, issues of justice, the common good, and human rights. So again, we often find ourselves on different sides of the fence, but we're both out there. Neither of us is the kind of scholar who restricts his activities to the classroom or to the library, Carol.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk about a couple of other issues. And again, I would encourage people to read this very good piece. Came out many months ago, but I think it illustrates again that we need honesty and courage. But I thought we'd come back and maybe talk about this, what Arthur Brooks, when he was on the program with us, talked about this culture of contempt in his book, Love Your Enemies, and really talk about how we can have civility, not contempt. And then, of course, also some of the things you talk about, we find ourselves in tribes, and Senator Ben Sasse in his book talks about how that sometimes we hate each other. We certainly believe our tribe is always right and never believe that the other person's political tribe is right, and sometimes we have to be honest about that. And those are some things that all relate, again, to the conversation that Professor Robert George and Cornel West have had together. So we'll take a break and continue our conversation with him right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Will censorship increase, or is the purge of some politicians' political content over? A few argue that now that President Trump is history, and now that a few malcontents have been removed from social media, our leaders can get back to governing. But there are too many voices who seem emboldened by the purges that have taken place. For example, the CEO of Mozilla argued that deplatforming people from its services was not enough. He believes that real change requires more than just the temporary silencing or permanent removal of bad actors. On a recent CNN program, a former Facebook officer called for carriers like Verizon, AT&T, and others to deplatform One American News Network and Newsmax. At Forbes, the chief content officer warned companies that might consider hiring somebody who worked in the Trump administration because he said Forbes will assume that everything your company or firm talks about is a lie. Another editor at Forbes warned that there would be a truth reckoning for such companies. Alfredo Ortiz, writing in Real Clear Politics, believes that big tech's coordinated silencing of conservative voices, including President Trump's, signals a crossing of the Rubicon in the debate over government involvement to protect free speech. Although those involved in this purge justify it as a way to prevent further rioting and violence, he believes it is a power grab. Even the ACLU warns it should concern everyone when companies like Facebook and Twitter wield the unchecked power to remove people from platforms that have become indispensable for the speech of billions. It seems to me that a purge has begun. It doesn't seem to me that it will stop anytime soon. Who will it destroy and when will it stop? Nobody really knows. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Professor Robert George of Princeton University for a few more minutes, and then a little bit later we'll open up the phones, give you a chance to make some comments. We'll get into some other issues in the news. If you'd like to know more about him, of course, we have information about that on our website. We have this article that Robert George and Cornel West posted to unite the country. We need honesty and courage, and so that is something you can find. And of course, if you just do a search, I did a search on the Point of View website just a minute ago. I think almost 36 different articles, either ones that we directly quote that were written by Robert George or ones where we quote him. So you can certainly find out a little bit more about him. But let's, if we can, Professor George, get into this issue of why this is so significant. Because there was a time, I guess you and I are old enough to remember, when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, they might disagree, but they still kind of have a relationship. And that was pretty typical. And now there's this idea of contempt that Arthur Brooks has talked about on this program with us, that my tribe or my team or my political party is right and yours is wrong. Actually, even more, yours is not just wrong, it's evil. And so in some respects, what you and Cornel West have tried to do is say, even if we come to different conclusions, we can still have a civil dialogue. Can you speak to that issue?
Well, yes. Now, let's not try to glamorize the past or suppose there's some ideal that we would be able to attain. We human beings, frail, fallen, fallible creatures that we are, we're given to tribalism. It's in our nature to form tribes. But that doesn't mean that we should always go with the tribe. On the contrary, we need a critical perspective on our own tribe. We'll always belong to some groups or another. And sometimes the groups we belong to will belong to based on shared beliefs. conservatives, Republicans, liberals, progressives, Catholics, Hindus, Muslims, Protestants. These are largely belief-based communities. And it's fine to be in such communities, but it's not fine to lose your critical perspective on them and to suppose that the community is always right, the tribe is always right, or that loyalty to the tribe requires that we never criticize the tribe or acknowledge even the goodwill of people who are outside the tribe or who challenge the tribe's opinions. So what Cornel and I are offering, and we're trying to model, is mutual respect. That is the idea we can respect people outside of our tribes, and also a willingness to learn. I learn from Cornel. He kindly says he learns from me, despite our differences. Catholics can learn from Protestants. Protestants can learn from Catholics. Jews can learn from Christians. Christians can learn from Jews. That doesn't mean we abandon our commitments or our beliefs about what's true or not true, but it's to acknowledge our own fallibility, our own limitedness, our own finitude. We need more of an openness to engaging other people and recognizing that, like us, they're travelers on a road. They are struggling to try to get it right, to understand the truth about this complex, often baffling world that we live in its many dimensions, its moral dimensions, its spiritual dimensions, and so forth. And I'll just conclude this comment by saying our situation is exacerbated today because of technology, I think, to a very considerable extent.
Yes.
We have gone into silos. So if you're on the conservative side, which is my side, you could simply shut yourself off from hearing liberal opinions. You watch Fox News, you read National Review, you look at the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and that's it. And you will be reinforced in your conservative views. Over on the liberal or progressive side, same thing. You can just watch MSNBC or CNN. You can read the New York Times. You can look at The Nation magazine, and that's it. Well, pretty soon, when you're siloed like that, you're going to come, because of the reinforcement of your beliefs that goes on 24 hours a day, you're going to come to the belief that only people who are either ill-motivated or stupid would disagree with you. That the people on the other side must be either fools or frauds. That all right-thinking, morally good people, people of goodwill, are on your side. And both sides have reached and reinforced themselves in that conclusion.
Yes. And what I find is that oftentimes, even if you are somewhat in a silo and you're a conservative, or if you say a Christian, since so many of our audience is a Christian, you go off to the public university, well, you're going to be hearing a lot more than a Christian point of view. When you turn on the TV, you open up a newspaper, if you still read newspapers, you're still going to be encountering some of that. And that, I thought, was one of the things that was most striking, because as somebody before I did this talk show used to speak on college campuses, I can think of almost any campus I've ever spoken on that would be glad to have Cornel West come and give a lecture. I can think of a lot of universities that would say, we do not want to have Robert George. And so in some respects, the liberals don't live in a world that ever includes religion or conservative ideas. Most Christians oftentimes find themselves having to live in both worlds, because if you go out there on the internet, you're going to be encountering all sorts of things. So what we need to do is do our best to try to tell people that we all need to read widely, and we all need to interact with people with whom we have very little in common, so that we really understand what is indeed taking place in our world. You think that's a fair statement?
Yeah, Kerby, let me comment on that. Let me begin by saying Cornel West himself has said to me that there's an asymmetry here. That is, conservatives these days are more open to listening to progressive points of view.
Very true.
Although we're far from perfect, than progressives are for listening to conservative points of view. He said this, for example, when we were together at the Conservative American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. He said to me, Brother Robbie, I've been welcomed here. I've been treated wonderfully. I've been listened to. And I'm not sure the same would be true for you if we were at a parallel progressive think tank. And I think that's right. Part of the problem here is that the progressives have a monopoly, as David Brooks rightly says, on the on cultural power in America. They control the major institutions.
Yes.
There are no major institutions of culture that are controlled by conservatives. It's all one way. That's the monopoly, as Brooks, to use the word Brooks uses. And, of course, that exacerbates the problem. It's an irony, I think, that liberals have historically styled themselves as the tolerant, open-minded people. And today, while there are lots of closed-minded and intolerant conservatives, there are more conservatives who are old-fashioned liberals than there are liberals who are old-fashioned liberals.
And again, I think that is kind of one of the difficulties in trying to get this civil dialogue beginning. But just since we're almost out of time here, I've encouraged people to go to maybe YouTube or other places to see how that plays out, because you've had some great interactions on places like Firing Line, the Federalist Society. Of course, you mentioned the American Enterprise Institute and many others. And so if we wanted to try to model that, we can only do what we can control in our worlds. We can't control another person's reaction. I think you have some pretty good models out there that people can follow both in print and in video. So if you might mention where we could find some of that, because I want that to be the basis upon which we develop this idea of civility and civil dialogue.
Well, as you mentioned, there are a lot of videos of our dialogues together at universities or think tanks, on Firing Line, on PBS, for example. There was a 3-hour program we did together on C-SPAN. The video of that is available online. Then there are our writings together. In addition to the writing that you've mentioned, that piece we did for the Boston Globe on honesty and courage, I would commend your listeners to look up a document we did together, a statement called Truth Seeking, Democracy and Freedom of Thought and Expression. Truth-seeking, democracy, and freedom of thought and expression. That's from 2017. And there we really lay out the case for the points that you and I, Kerby, are talking about today. And if readers agree with what we say there, they're invited to sign on to the statement.
Very good. I might just mention next hour we're going to have Rachel Bovard, and we're going to be talking about big tech, and that kind of reminds me of course, the work you did on the Manhattan Declaration and some of the others that had censorship. So if nothing else, we have quoted you many times. It is great, an honor and an opportunity and a privilege to have you on the program, and we look forward to the next opportunity. And thank you for setting a very good model for how we can engage in a civil dialogue. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure. Thank you, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and we'll get into some of these other issues in the news. Again, I commend to you the article we've posted. We'll see if we can post some of the others, but again, you can do a Google search and find some of the ones that Robert George mentioned. And when we come back, okay, I'll talk about for a few minutes the issue of impeachment, because after all, the article of impeachment was taken over from the House to the Senate. Next month, there will be a trial. There shouldn't be, and I think there will be an acquittal, but I'll explain that briefly. Then we want to get into some of the other issues, because after all, we've had this flurry of executive orders signed by Joe Biden, and the possible impact on jobs is significant. And so one of the articles we posted is in that regard. So we have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We had Professor Robert George on, and he mentioned that particular statement. It is actually part of the James Madison program at Princeton, and I just have a link here. I think maybe Steve will probably get Karen to put it up there in case you'd like to follow it. Kind of a who's who of individuals that have signed it. Some of whom I say I really have difficulty even believing that they signed it, but that's maybe good news. Maybe we have more in common with some of these individuals than we thought. So I thought, if nothing else, if you'd like to find that statement, it will be up there. In addition, of course, the article I posted from the Boston Globe, which you can read in its entirety. Let's get into a couple of issues. I'm going to do this sort of half and half. Some issues now, then we're going to be talking with our good friend Rachel Bovard, who was in studio with us a while back. She has a piece that came out in USA Today about Parler and Big Tech, and we're going to get into all of that. Relates very much to my Viewpoints commentary yesterday and my Viewpoints commentary today about Big Tech, so we'll get into that. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Okay, second impeachment of President Donald Trump. This one is going to be more difficult. It is going to be one that I don't think is going to go very far for a couple of very good reasons. Here is in my hand a copy of the Constitution. I encourage you to get one, or maybe ask for one. And when you read Article 1, Section 3, the first thing you recognize is it really seems to be implying that impeachment is for impeachment and removal. How do you remove somebody that's not in the office in the first place? Number two, it tells you that the impeachment trial has to be convened by the Chief Justice of the United States. That would be John Roberts. Is that going to take place in February? Oh, no. Instead, senior Democrat Pat Leahy will actually be there. So that shows you almost even instantaneously that it's not like the typical impeachment. And I think we've so devalued the word impeachment and made impeachment sort of like indictment now. You know, you can indict just about anybody, but that doesn't mean you can convict them. And there are all sorts of people over the years that have been indicted for something they never did. So there's a sense in which that is the case. And then finally, in order for to have impeachment and removal, I should say, you'd have to have all 50 Democratic senators vote for removal, and you'd have to have at least, 17 Republicans. I don't think that's going to happen, but I could be wrong. But again, the argument being made is that you can remove somebody who's been removed, and have we ever done that before? Okay, I've dug a little bit. There was a time in England where there was an attempt to impeach Warren Hastings, who was the former Governor General of Bengal. Well, again, I don't want to, first of all, use British common law to interpret the U.S. Constitution. So the closest thing we have happened in 1876. That is where the United States Senate held a trial of the former War Secretary, and that in this particular case, William Belknap, in part because he was acquitted simply because I think most of the senators said, how can we remove the War Secretary who, after he was impeached, simply resigned? And so that's kind of the issue. There's another reason to believe that this is kind of a sham impeachment, and that is equal protection, a right to actually be able to defend yourself among your accusers. We had a snap impeachment vote in the House, and there was no, it was kind of like a show trial, and there was no attempt to even allow the president's defense to make a defense and to point out some pretty erroneous facts that have been assumed. And one of those is that the group that actually went against the Capitol on January 6th was even related to the group that was at the ellipse hearing the president speak. And you know all the other arguments. But nevertheless, trial begins February 9th. I'm hoping that maybe there will be enough courage on the part of some of the Republicans to simply call for ending of that trial before the trial even begins. But nevertheless, that is all we really can talk about right now, or should talk about, because I think it has proved itself to be debasing of what was considered to be a very solemn activity back not so long ago. And there is, I think, a sad commentary on the fact that some individuals, looking at the notes of the Constitutional Convention, reading the Federalist Papers and others, have concluded that the impeachment of an officer was such a solemn event that it was considered to be at maybe the highest order, up there with maybe declaration of war. And now it has been so debased. And again, I'll be willing to say that some of it may have been debased with the attempt to impeach Bill Clinton, but it certainly has been debased in the 2 subsequent impeachments of Donald Trump. Let's get on to some other issues here. First article I've posted for you here, very good piece by Fred Lucas. He does a good job on this regard, in which he talks about the potential job losses that just simply come from these executive orders. He has 4 of those, so I'll give you a quick summary of each one, but again, it may be something that you might want to read in its entirety, because he goes on for about 5 pages to document all of this. The first one we've already kind of discussed yesterday, but it's worth mentioning again, the Keystone XL pipeline. He actually argues that it could indeed mean that 11,000 American jobs will simply vanish, or in many cases already have. I've heard some stories of individuals who were told to clean out your locker, that's it. And so there have been some fact checkers that say, well, maybe it's not 11,000, maybe it's a little less than that. I've seen some others that say, forget the 11,000. You're also talking about just the 11,000 jobs, but then the others related to that in terms of truckers, manufacturers, instrument producers, all sorts of other things. And so, again, there are some people that have actually talked about these contractors who will be responsible for hiring those individuals and the rest. And so, again, he goes into some detail documenting the potential job loss of 11,000 jobs. The second one is even more significant, and that is to now require a federal minimum wage that will essentially almost double from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour. We know the impact of that because we have seen the impact of raising the minimum wage over the years, and we have a number of very good examples of how minimum wage has led to job loss in places that have asked for it and actually implemented it, like Seattle and others. And so, again, the estimate there is that for the people who indeed actually receive an increase in the minimum wage, that's going to be a real blessing or benefit to them. But the requirement now is that federal contractors will have to pay a minimum wage of $15 an hour and also provide emergency paid leave. The estimates are that this could ultimately affect 3.7 million jobs. And again, it goes into some estimates about what that would do, because if indeed you can only hire so many people at $15 an hour, and you could hire more people at, say, $8 an hour or $10 an hour, whatever that might be, you can see how ultimately that leads to job loss. The third is the issue of the climate accord, the Paris Climate Accord. And this one is, I think, based upon the idea that if indeed we were not only part of the Paris Climate Accord, but we also started to implement some of those requirements in terms of regulations, emissions reduction targets, and the rest, that could also affect about 3.1 million jobs. That, of course, is based on the assumption that we do anything more than just actually become part of the climate accord, because actually, as I've documented in previous commentaries, if there's one modern industrialized country that has done the best of actually reaching some of those emission targets, It was the United States, even when it was not part of the Paris Climate Accord. But nevertheless, that's one other issue. And then the fourth and final one, eliminating freelance employment. This would be what's called the PRO Act. That stands for Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which is basically prohibiting contract or freelance work as well as part-time work. I'll get into that maybe in the future because it involves a lot more kind of technical issues, but nevertheless illustrates again that there are some very significant economic consequences to these executive acts and these various executive orders. And so I think it's appropriate to say, if indeed that's the case, what does that do to the job creation in America and the job loss in America? And as I've said before, sometimes when you ask the question, you're told to be quiet, sit down, and just take it. And that tells you a lot about the fact that maybe this administration so far doesn't have an answer to those questions. Let's take a break. We'll get back into some other issues right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just mention at the top of the hour, Rachel Bovard will be with us. We'll be talking about big tech. She'll also talk about Parler and what is happening there. She's been kind of on that issue for some time, and if you would like to read her piece, it appeared in USA Today, and we have posted it on our website for you to read as well. My second article that I thought I'd get to just before we take the top of the hour is by our good friend Matt Walsh, and he entitles it, "A Return to Normalcy and Decency decency under Biden means forcing girls to share bathrooms with boys, and points out that really during most of his career, Senator Joe Biden, now President Joe Biden, never really showed interest in transgenderism of any sort, but now that's become the issue of the day, so he's interested in it. And so his first step was to actually name Rachel Levine to be the Assistant Health and Human Services Secretary, who had served in the past as the Health Secretary of Pennsylvania. Those of you in the Keystone State know exactly what this is. This is an individual who was a male who believes that now she is a woman, and this was seen as a historic pick. Now, Matt Walsh, before he gets into the transgenderism, points out it may be historic in the sense that, indeed, Levine is perhaps the first Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services to be appointed despite overseeing what many people think has been a disastrous pandemic response that resulted in the death of thousands of elderly people, because Pennsylvania, like the state of New York, was among one of the states that required nursing homes to accept patients who had tested positive for the virus. And we've talked about that before in terms of what happened in New York, so obviously you can see what happens there. But then on the first day in office, not only did President Joe Biden issue a flurry of executive orders, many of which, as I pointed out just a minute ago, are going to affect the economy. Others that will affect, and by the way, when I was talking about the economic impact, I didn't even talk about closing down the building of the wall. There's all sorts of job loss there, too. And, of course, the impact that that will have on immigration and actually having a freeze on deportation and the rest, but also had one order, which has got this very long title: Preventing and Combating Discrimination on the Basis of Gender Identity or Sexual Orientation. Now, if you want to read it, you can, but let me give you the relevant verse or two, sentences, maybe about 2 sentences give you enough there. And that is, by authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered as followed. Every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear no matter who they are and whom they love. Children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. Sounds real good. Let's dig into the fine print. Matt Walsh puts it this way. First of all, is the problem that no child has ever been denied access to the restroom, locker room, or school sports. Boys have always been perfectly free to use the boys' room and play on boys' sports teams. But gender-confused boys have always been just as welcome in those same facilities and take advantage of the same athletic opportunities as other boys. So it doesn't matter, how you think about your sex, your gender, because we already know that. So the question isn't that we are somehow keeping boys from going to boys' restrooms, keeping boys from going to boys' locker rooms, or keeping boys from playing in school sports for boys. You with me on this? Okay. I know this is common sense. Most of you are shaking your head saying, duh, and others were going, I don't know about this. Really, Matt Walsh says, the question is whether a boy who says he's trans should have access to any restroom he wants or any sports team he wants, even if it means infringing on the rights of biological girls. Let's talk about the other rights here. It's the rights of the trans boy or girl, however you want to try to describe that. But there's also the rights of the biological girls. And he says the answer to that question from any sane and moral person is no. You should not have access to any restroom you want. It's a simple matter of common sense, a simple matter of basic moral decency. Obviously, we should not compel young girls to disrobe in a locker room in front of boys, nor should we force them to sacrifice spots on their teams for boys who have inherent biological advantages over them, no matter how a small minority of gender-confused boys might feel about that. Now, what I've just said gets you in a lot of trouble. but I guess I've never shied away from controversy here on Point of View. But it is basic common sense. One more point, and then we need to take a break. And that is Matt Walsh, first of all, points out the issue of whether boys are being prohibited from being in a boys' restroom, locker room, or school sports. They're not. But the bigger issue now is, second point, he says, is the Constitution. Oh, here again, that Constitution, that one I'm holding up right now, because the Constitution in no way whatsoever vests in the president the authority to decide which sports teams a child can play on or which locker rooms they may use. This, by any reasonable interpretation, is not a legal power granted to the president. Remember when I read that preamble, it talked about the power vested in me as president by the Constitution. That power, Mr. President, was never given to you. We have certain powers, enumerated powers, which are actually given to the federal government, even smaller number of powers than those given to the federal government to the president. And the rest of the powers, if they're not enumerated, what? They're reserved to the states and the people. This is Constitution 101. Maybe he missed that day in class when he was in law school. I don't know. But nevertheless, that is the case. And so he says this, by any reasonable interpretation, is not a legal power granted to the president. In fact, no president anywhere has the legitimate moral or legal authority to demand that girls share locker rooms with boys. Anyone who enacts or enforces such a policy is infringing on the human rights of those girls and thus acting in a fundamentally unlawful way. Lest you think that our reaction here from Matt Walsh, Kerby Anderson, or anybody else is because we're just a bunch of narrow-minded people, there have been a number of feminists that have been very upset about this as well. There have been a number of prominent women athletic coaches, players, and others that have been upset about this as well because they feared that some kind of executive order like this would come down after it had been imposed in some states and in some bizarre interpretations even under the previous Obama administration. But nevertheless, this is where President Joe Biden has claimed this authority on himself. Matt Walsh says, so it's important for him. It's apparently so crucial in his mind that girls be forced to expose themselves in front of biological boys that he made it a day one priority. And when you go and look at those, most people count 17 executive orders, whether they are really major orders like the Keystone XL pipeline or the wall or the halting of the deportation of individuals, or even one that I mentioned yesterday, the disbanding of the 1776 Commission, or this one, promoting transgenderism, you can, I think, get a very good indication of what's going to happen in the future. As I like to say sometimes, it's just sort of a preview of coming attractions. Well, let me give you a preview of the next hour. We'll have Rachel Bovard with us. She's been in studio with us before. She has written some very good material, actually co-authored a book with Jim DeMint, but she's also written about this whole issue of big tech and Parler. And if you'd like to join us, I'm sure you probably have some comments about big tech and about censorship and maybe even using social media. So I encourage you to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. You can find these articles on our website, pointofview.net, and we'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me to the Tuesday edition of Point of View. This hour we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about big tech, and then we'll get into some other issues in the news. My commentary yesterday was on whether or not we could even regulate big tech, and then today the one on big tech purge, and that's a perfect setup for, first of all, the conversation we're going to have with Rachel Bovard. We have posted her particular article that appeared in USA Today about the Twitter ban on Donald Trump's account was only the beginning of big tech's crackdown. So in some respects, a lot of parallel between some of the things she's been writing about and some of the things that we've been posting on our website. If you're not familiar with her, she's been in studio with us before and has been involved. Matter of fact, last time she was in studio with us, we were talking with her and former Senator Jim DeMint about the book Conservative: Knowing What to Keep. She is an individual that has served as the legislative director for Senator Rand Paul, also served as a policy director for the Senate Steering Committee. She served as the director of policy services at the Heritage Foundation, co-author of that book with Jim DeMint, and is a graduate of Grove City College, as well as holding a master's degree in graduate school in political management from George Washington University. And Rachel, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Okay, what about this? We have probably a lot of questions on the table. One, of course, is whether or not we will ever be able to, if you will, regulate the big tech, which we can maybe get to in just a few minutes. But your commentary that came out to USA Today was really warning us that taking Donald Trump's account out is only the beginning, and since you've written that, we are starting to see this growing list of individuals, and now even Parler, that are being purged because of big tech's monopoly. Can you kind of give us a background on how that's happening and what might happen in the future?
Yeah, I didn't mean to. I hoped I wasn't being prophetic in writing that piece, actually, but it turned out I kind of was, because Donald Trump was really just the tip of the iceberg. You know, what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is, to your point, individuals being purged, businesses being purged. You know, from elected officials on down, Twitter's removed close to 80,000 accounts for people they say are trafficking in misinformation. And then, you know, strikingly, there was a full-on corporate assault against Parler, which was the popular sort of mainstream conservative alternative to Twitter. You saw first Google Play and Apple remove the app from its app store, and then Amazon Web Services, which people don't realize but provides a lot of the web hosting services across the internet. They axed Parler as well, so Parler's website couldn't even be accessed either. And they did that on the grounds that they said, well, you know, the violence that happened on January 6th was organized on Parler. That may be true, but we also know, and there's been substantial reporting, that a lot of what happened on January 6th was organized on the bigger platforms as well, but you're not seeing similar action taken by Apple, Google, or Amazon against Twitter or Facebook. So what's really happening is disturbing, because it almost looks like big, corporate power punishing people for the views they hold. And this is something we always were worried would happen, and now I think we are actually seeing it happen. And I think finally the most disturbing part about it is that you're seeing Democratic politicians attempt to use this corporate power to their advantage. You saw Michelle Obama, didn't go to Congress to complain about Donald Trump. She didn't go to Donald Trump to complain about Donald Trump. She asked Facebook and Twitter to take him down. And then, in fact, they did. And you saw several Democrat senators make the same plea. So our politics is now really devolving into weaponizing these platforms against political opponents and political speech. And I think this is a very dark moment for free speech in America.
Since we're talking about Parler for just a minute, stay on that, because you get two conflicting reports, and I want to be fair to both sides. One said, well, Parler wasn't doing enough self-policing, and it had various threats that were allowed because it's such a libertarian kind of site. On the other hand, I've heard people say, well, the reason they went after Parler is because they were fearful that after Donald Trump was taken off of Twitter, that's maybe where he would show up next. And again, back to your point about whether Parler was used to actually pull together some of the actions taking place on January 6th. Glenn Greenwald, who we've quoted a couple of times, said the first 13 people actually arrested for that storming of the Capitol, none of them even had Parler accounts. So was it possible that Apple and Google Play Store and then eventually Amazon were just using that as an excuse, or were there some legitimate concerns there?
So I think there's two ways to look at it. In terms of answering your first issue about, whether or not they were following, quote unquote, the rules set for them, by Apple and Google. Well, Parler was, according to Parler, was attempting to police its content. But if the standard is going to be, that any sort of threats or any violent rhetoric that shows up on any platform gets you banned from the App Store, well, I would point to the fact that the government of Myanmar used Facebook to incite a genocide against minorities in its country. ISIS frequently uses Facebook to organize itself. Child sexual abuse material circulates and proliferates on these platforms, and the companies can't get a hold of that or say they cannot. So if there is a standard here, it does not feel like it is being evenly applied, and I think that's a concern conservatives would raise. I also have seen the Glenn Greenwald reporting as well, suggesting that these users or these protesters didn't even have Parler accounts, which would suggest, and this is the concerning thing, that yes, actually, they are just attempting to sort of shut down the access of certain individuals to the marketplace. But I think more broadly,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
But I think more broadly, the Parler example really resonates with people because for years, we were told as conservatives who are unhappy with the big tech platforms, well, okay, fine, build your own platform. And John Massey did. He built his own platform, and it was the first successful mainstream alternative to the big tech platforms. But what has happened is not just that they've kicked him off, right, the app stores. They have ripped away the guts of capitalism from Parler, from John Massey, because it wasn't just Amazon Web Services, which you need to access the internet. It was all of their email providers. It was Slack, which is an internal work messaging services, refused to work with Parler. They said various infrastructure services were not provided to them as well. So it's this sort of collusion of corporate power against certain viewpoints that should be very concerning to all of us.
And again, I've seen you on with Tucker Carlson, but I've also seen the CEO of Parler on there, and he said, it's kind of like saying McDonald's, well, you're making hamburgers, so you also need to be responsible for your own heating and plumbing and put different lighting. After a while, you're going, wait a minute. We are a platform, but when you take out from under us the Amazon Web Services and you take out from under us all sorts of other things, you begin to say, as we will talk about maybe after the break, what does this mean for the future? Because if all of a sudden you're in a organization, a ministry, a business, and PayPal says, we're not going to let you do that anymore. We as a bank have decided that we won't let you use a credit card. And you can very quickly disable almost anybody because we all are dependent on each other. But with this sort of cancel culture, and especially with this monopoly, we have some really important issues that need to be addressed. So we'll come back. We'll talk about what about this Section 230, who owns the public square, and that is a conversation we're having today with Rachel Bovard. We'll continue our conversation with her right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Will censorship increase, or is the purge of some politicians' political content over? A few argue that now that President Trump is history, and now that a few malcontents have been removed from social media, our leaders can get back to governing. But there are too many voices who seem emboldened by the purges that have taken place. For example, the CEO of Mozilla argued that deplatforming people from its services was not enough. He believes that real change requires more than just the temporary silencing or permanent removal of bad actors. On a recent CNN program, a former Facebook officer called for carriers like Verizon, AT&T, and others to deplatform One American News Network and Newsmax. At Forbes, the chief content officer warned companies that might consider hiring somebody who worked in the Trump administration because he said Forbes will assume that everything your company or firm talks about is a lie. Another editor at Forbes warned that there would be a truth reckoning for such companies. Alfredo Ortiz, writing in Real Clear Politics, believes that big tech's coordinated silencing of conservative voices, including President Trump's, signals a crossing of the Rubicon in the debate over government involvement to protect free speech. Although those involved in this purge justify it as a way to prevent further rioting and violence, he believes it is a power grab. Even the ACLU warns it should concern everyone when companies like Facebook and Twitter wield the unchecked power to remove people from platforms that have become indispensable for the speech of billions. It seems to me that a purge has begun. It doesn't seem to me that it will stop anytime soon. Who will it destroy and when will it stop? Nobody really knows. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, continue our conversation with Rachel Bovard, who is a Senior Director of Policy at Conservative Partnership Institute. We have a link to that on our website, but also this a very good piece that Rachel wrote in USA Today. And Rachel, let's, if we can, talk about who owns the public square, because part of that gets back to a decision made many years ago when we had what was known as the Communications Decency Act, and we were broadcasting here from Point of View, and it includes a Section 230, which basically immunizes those social media platforms from liability. Now, there is a real push right now to try to change that. I'm not sure that that would take place, but the argument at least is that these social media organizations were platforms. This is kind of like a public square. If I go out to a park and I get a permission slip or I get a various kind of legal documents allowing me to set up a gazebo or a platform and I began to speak, there are all sorts of things that might be said from that platform that would not allow you to then go and sue the owner of the park or of the city, whether it was a communist group, whether it was a conservative group, whether it was Christian or atheist, whatever. And yet these platforms aren't really acting like platforms. They're acting more like publishers. But explain that, if you might, to us.
Yeah, Section 230, again, it was passed in 1996 at the birth of the Internet, right? It was designed to help the Internet grow, and it does two things. It says that whatever the companies cannot be sued for third-party content. So whatever we put on Facebook, Facebook cannot be sued for it. But it also does another thing, and it allows an exception for good faith removal of content. Basically, allows these providers to take down whatever they choose to without liability. Now, they have a First Amendment right, obviously, to do that as well, but this privileges their First Amendment right, okay? Because like movies, and newspapers, radio shows, for instance, are all subject to certain liabilities for what they say on their platforms. Social media companies are not. And so they're First Amendment actors, but they have a special privilege that everybody else doesn't. And this has, of course, allowed them to grow very large and very powerful. And it also protects, smaller companies as well, protects comment sites on the internet. So there is still, I think, a purpose to it. But most of the attention has been focused on the benefit it provides, the very, very big tech companies. And there's a lot of light and heat sort of generated around this issue because at the end of the day, this is a subsidy, right? You have a government carve out for these businesses around which they've structured their entire business model. And so my test for a subsidy is if you took it away, would the business model change significantly? If the answer is yes, then it's probably a subsidy. So that is what Section 230 is. There is, I think, a really credible argument that the companies have, and with the help of the courts, distorted Section 230's application far beyond its original intent. And actually, Justice Clarence Thomas recently hinted at this as well in some writing that he did on a different case. And it's worth checking out because he basically says, look, Section 230 was a trade, essentially, right? The government said, hey, we don't want porn online, essentially. We don't want our kids to have to look at this. And the original title of the bill was called the Family Online Empowerment Act. We don't want our kids to have to look at this, so we are going to make it easier for you to remove content so that you clean up the internet and make it a family-friendly place. That was the original intent, but it has been stretched by the courts and judicially interpreted such that it now covers all kinds of things that weren't originally anticipated in 1996. And this includes, harassment. This includes, all kinds of, child sexual abuse material. The platforms aren't liable for it. And it sort of has incentivized some bad behavior, some lazy behavior from these platforms in ways I don't think was originally intended. And so that is the focus of lawmakers right now. They're saying, should we actually update this law to reflect the modern reality, or should we strip it entirely because the platforms aren't living up to their end of the bargain?
It's a very good question. And again, you brought up another topic that many people have raised, and they say, well, of course we have to do some censorship. And by that, we mean certainly we don't want pornography, especially child pornography on the internet and on these social media platforms. We don't want sexual trafficking links on social media platform. And so I think whether you're a liberal or conservative, whether you're a libertarian or maybe very concerned about some of the kinds of ideas and toxic ideas out on the internet, most of us can agree, at least on some levels, that some censorship is necessary. But it's when it seems to always go in one direction that's sort of what you were talking about in USA Today. There is sort of a double standard in terms of what is considered to be incitement, because you could certainly say, was there something that Black Lives Matter said on their platforms, or Antifa said on their platform, or other countries and leaders and totalitarian governments have said on their platforms for incitement. And at the same time, you could also say that it is amazing, but rarely do you see real liberal content being censored, and you see an enormous amount of conservative content being censored. So there is a sense in which the line's a little bit blurred, but we still live in a real world where we have to make some decisions, and it does seem to me that what's happening right now out of Silicon Valley is of concern, especially given the fact that it can have a profound election on future elections as it did on this last election.
Yeah, that's what I think a lot of people are waking up to, is that, what started was a real legitimate concern, in my view, that, conservative content, conservative voices were being silenced from, again, what is essentially a virtual public square, to almost the collusive, corporate cooperation, to not just silence conservatives, but silence any views with which they disagree. And effectively, when these companies work together, you are effectively removed from the internet, right? And that's where President Trump now finds himself, barred by every major platform. His credit card companies or his banks won't work with him. Stripe, a credit card processing company, won't process transactions for his campaign, and on and on and on. And so how do you deal with what I call sort of the woke corporate culture that has the power to shut you off from the mechanisms of public life, to, effectively shut you off from the free market. How do we as conservatives respond to that? I think is going to be the challenge over the next 2 or 3 years, because unfortunately we're seeing it weaponized against us.
Let's, if we can, talk about some of the resources that would be available for our listeners, because first of all, we have made available booklets on everything from media bias to social media, and of course commentaries yesterday and even today on that issue. But if you go to conservativepartnership.org, you have all sorts of other resources in addition to, of course, what we've posted on our website today from USA Today. So talk about what you and Jim Dement and others are making available, because those are some resources I know our listeners might want to know more about.
Sure. Well, if you go to conservativepartnership.org, our latest blog post, which is on the homepage, contains a number of links to pieces I've written about this problem, how to think about it, what possibly conservatives should be proposing as a policy matter. Because at the end of the day, I do think it's time for policy engagement on this front. As conservatives, we've said the free market can solve this problem. We'll build our alternatives. We'll sort of, hopefully the market will solve it. But we've seen with Parler, we can build as many alternatives as we want, and the speech police will still come for us. Every avenue of free enterprise will be shut down. And so what do we do here? I think the first thing that has to happen is Section 230 reform, but also we should look at antitrust enforcement against these companies. Yes. Far from being regulatory, right? Antitrust enforcement is law enforcement. These laws exist on the books because being a predatory monopoly is illegal in this country. And so that's something I think conservatives need to look seriously at. And it's possible that, our internet ecosystem has evolved such that cloud providers like Amazon Web Services, like Cloudflare, that provide the guts of the internet, have now reached the status of common carriers and should be treated as such, and they cannot discriminate based on viewpoint. But these are all things I think our lawmakers need to be considering. And so I think it's time for the conservative movement to get literate in this and, set the expectation for their lawmakers.
Rachel Bovard with us. And again, go to conservativepartnership.org. We, of course, have the one from USA Today. If you go there, you can also read her piece that appeared in Newsweek and all sorts of other great, insightful thoughts and ideas. And so, Rachel, it was great to have you in studio. It's great to have you on the program with us today, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Thanks so much for having me.
Again, you can find all that information on our website. My commentary today is talking about this big tech purge in which, you have the CEO of Mozilla saying, it's really not enough just to deplatform these people. We need to do much more than that. And you had one CNN officer, or one individual on CNN, a former Facebook officer, I should say, who's actually saying, maybe it's time for Verizon and AT&T and others to just deplatform some of these groups like, Newsmax and One America News Network and all of the rest. And so it, I think, illustrates a point that, as Rachel said, wasn't trying to be prophetic, but her point was Twitter ban on Donald Trump's account was only the beginning of the big tech crackdown. If you want to see more evidence of that, my commentary today on the big tech purge. We'll be right back.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Have a question for you. Do you think the last election was fair? If you think that there was some corruption or there was maybe some voting irregularities or maybe even voter fraud, do you think that the answer to that is to have more of it? That seems to be what's being suggested right now. And so it brings me to my fourth and final article that we've posted here. And this one comes from our good friend Mike Huckabee, in which he calls this the Democracy Destruction Act of 2021. But to introduce it, he takes us back to Sunday. And some of you may have seen this if you've been out on the internet, because you had on George Stephanopoulos' ABC Sunday show, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. And it got pretty heated pretty fast, because what you had was George Stephanopoulos starting off by saying, can't you just simply say that President Biden won a legitimate and fair election? Actually started out, I think, saying, can you just disagree that there was a stealing of the election? And so it got pretty crazy pretty fast. Matter of fact, if you've watched a transcript, watched it or read a transcript, I guess is a better way to say it, sometimes it's just so much crosstalk, you're not even sure who's saying anything. But what Senator Paul was trying to bring out is that he felt that there were some unconstitutional ways in which laws were changed by courts and secretaries of state. I don't really think that's controversial, but if you're trying to get to the bottom line, which George Stephanopoulos was, that the election was not stolen, then you don't see all the nuance of, well, I don't know if it's stolen or not, but there were some things that were obviously violated, in which you can go to state constitutions which make it very clear that the state legislature is responsible for making those changes. And with a whole judicial ruling, a federal judge changed things all of the time. And of course, then Ron Paul did get into some of the others, because he said there were people, were there people that voted twice? Were there dead people who voted? Were there illegal aliens who voted? Yes. And we should get to the bottom of it. Well, George Stephanopoulos would have none of that, because he was pointing out the fact that we need to really begin to go through our voter rolls to make sure that the right people, eligible people, are on the rolls, not ineligible people. And so then you had all sorts of back and forth, and we can go through that for some time. But what Rand Paul was pointing out, is that 75% of them Republicans, he said, agree with me that we need to look at election integrity. And I think if you have even a slight bit of hesitation about what happened in 2020, you want to try to solve some of that before 2022. Does that make sense? Of course it does. And so that was all of the back and forth. And so Rand Paul finally said, I plan on spending the next 2 years going around from state to state and fixing these problems. Good for him. And I won't be cowed by liberals in the media who say there's no evidence here. You're a liar if you talk about election fraud. No, let's have an open debate. Let's have a free country. Well, the bottom line is that Mike Huckabee was using this as a setup for a piece of legislation that is H.R. 1. And this, interestingly enough, is called the Democracy Restoration Act of 2021. We've been here before. If you want to go back a year ago, you can find my January commentaries on, I think it's January 6, 2020, in which at that time H.R. 1 was called For the People Act. But it's the same thing. It's basically wanting to call for nationwide mail-in ballots. Oh, what could go wrong there? For unrestricted ballot harvesting. Oh, my gosh, nothing could go wrong there, could it? The end to voter ID. And then allowing all sorts of individuals, including convicted criminals, the opportunity to vote. Okay, so this is why Mike Huckabee refers to it, and you can read this in its entirety, which is our fourth article on the website. And I do encourage you to read it, because he goes into more detail than I can even go into in the next about 5 or 6 minutes. But let me go through it real quickly. And he says really what this is what he could call the Democracy Destruction Act of 2021. It is virtually identical to the For the People Act a year ago, so you can read my commentary then. But let me go through a few of these. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. First of all, he says the bill essentially requires every state to do away with their own set of rules for elections, because what does it do? It kind of federalizes the elections. No state gets to require more than the last 4 digits of a Social Security number. Each state must accept internet-only registration, including the signature. Every state must have automatic registration to vote. That's what's called the motor voter law, unless the individual specifically declines it. Every state has to allow 16-year-olds to register to vote, although the states won't have to let them vote until they're 18. Well, you can see where that's going to take us. Then it goes on, in no state may a person other than the state or local election official call for voter rolls to be brought up to date, which is something that Tom Fitton's been on this program, and, of course, Hans von Spakowski, John Fund, Eric Eggers, all sorts of people on this program have talked about as well. And then all states must have a period of early voting. All states must participate in uniform absentee balloting, which is essentially nationwide mail-in balloting, is really what it's used by a different name. Relative to that, a state may not require an individual to provide any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot other than just a signature or similar affirmation. Oh, what could go wrong there? Here's something that Mike Huckabee says reminds us a little bit of our listeners up there in Wisconsin with the drop boxes, because a voter can designate any person to return a voted and sealed absentee ballot to the post office, a ballot drop-off location, a tribally designated building or election office, so long as the person designated to return the ballot does not receive any compensation based on the number of ballots the person has returned. Of course, it says nothing about the voters receiving compensation, but we'll leave that for another day. By the way, there's no limit on the number of voted and sealed ballots a designated person can return. Yeah, what could possibly go wrong with that? That's ballot harvesting on steroids. And then Mike Huckabee says, I've saved the most chilling one for last. This is the Section 3201. National Strategy to Protect United States Democratic Institutions. This calls for the president, I guess that would be Joe Biden right now, in consultation with various cabinet members and agency officials to develop over the next year a plan to deal with a number of possible occurrences, including an influence operation or disinformation campaign that could cause the erosion of public trust or undermine the security and integrity of United States democratic institutions. And Mike Huckabee says, gosh, isn't Twitter already doing that? Well, the bottom line is it illustrates, I think, only so well what can happen when you get to what essentially is becoming one-party rule. This particular piece of legislation, if I remember right, I'll have to go look up and see whether H.R. 1 for the People Act passed, but I'm pretty sure it did. And I have no reason to believe that this particular piece of legislation this time won't pass the House, which is called, again, the Democracy Restoration Act of 2021. It's labeled H.R. 1 because it's seen as kind of the first priority for Congress, so you can see how it could certainly pass the House of Representatives. Then what happens when it gets to the Senate? Are there enough, if you will, more sober-minded individuals to recognize the kind of scam this would be or not? Good question to really ask about that. So that is certainly the case, but if indeed it passes muster or is placed as an amendment to a must-pass piece of legislation like the budget, you could at least theoretically see how it might pass the Senate. And does anybody think that Joe Biden wouldn't sign it? This is, in a sense, taking everything that actually assured, I think, his election in some of these swing states to now spread it nationwide. Of course, there's another question I have about this. It is really hard to see how the Supreme Court, given its current complexion, could possibly give a thumbs up to this, but we've lived in stranger times, haven't we? And so I thought we'd end with that piece and just illustrating again that if you've had some questions and concerns about the last election, there is an attempt now to say, let's take all those things that many of us have concerns about and let's institutionalize them from the federal government all the way down. I think it doesn't pass constitutional muster because the Constitution makes it pretty clear that the elections are not federal, the elections are state. And that may be sometimes frustrating because of some of the different state laws, but it probably is the best safety valve that we have right now. And one of the reasons why one would hope this would never actually be implemented into law. But stranger things have happened, as they did in 2020 and as they could in 2021. Well, that's all we have for today. If you find yourself saying, okay, I've got to read these for myself, all 4 of those articles on the website, I've put them up there for you to read and for you to learn about that as well. And so I hope that you will appreciate that. And so we will spend some time getting to that, but we need to take a break, and we'll be back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention, I did look it up over the break, and yes, the For the People Act did pass from the House of Representatives, went to the Senate calendar and went nowhere, as you might imagine. But we have a different House and a very different Senate this time, and of course, a very different president this time, so that is a possibility. I want to get into some other topics, but let's take some phone calls first. We'll go out to Georgia on the Good News Network. Andy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Thank you for all you do, and I'll be brief. I know it's up against the end of the show. Situations occurred where a family member has been hospitalized, a middle-aged family member, and we're not allowed to visit, or certainly we can pray from where we are, but the idea that we're not allowed to at least send our pastor in or one family member in to lay hands on and offer up a prayer is disturbing to me, and I just wonder if you've had any time, or perhaps you've done it on the show already, any dialogue about this matter.
Well, it does seem to me that there should be some exceptions provided for that, because we do recognize that, especially if somebody was terminal, that the sad commentary that sometimes is coming out is if these are individuals that are losing their life and they have to die alone, at this point we're not concerned about them catching the disease. We certainly could do something that would separate an individual so they could be able to see them. We have electronics and things of that nature to do that. And so I just sometimes am concerned about what seems to be an understandable desire to keep people safe and not to spread a very communicable disease. But on the other hand, to maybe not keep into perspective the importance of human contact, the importance of praying for the sick, and so much more. So, I mean, I wish I had a better answer for it, but I think that there are some of these rules that have been implemented not only by the states, but even by the hospitals are just inappropriate, and I wish I could give you a better answer for that other than maybe to raise some questions with a local official, maybe your county judge or healthcare professionals, and say this is something we want to do, and we shouldn't always be so concerned about safety that we never allow for the importance of human touch and prayer and those kinds of things. So wish I had a better answer, but maybe if any of our listeners have some better answers or have had better experiences, maybe they can send us an email or something, or we can even do a program in the future on that topic, because I think it's certainly very appropriate.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kirby. God bless you.
I just wish I had a better answer for that. But since you brought that up, I thought I would mention real quickly some of the questions being raised right now about the vaccination distribution. And just the other day, we had the new CDC director, that is Rochelle Walensky. Dr. Lewinsky is actually coming from Harvard Medical School. But here she's on a talk show saying that we really can't tell you how many vaccines have been made. We can't tell you how they've been distributed. And I just sort of roll my eyes. Okay, you can say it's all Trump's fault. After a couple of weeks of this, you can't say it's Trump's fault anymore. You've got people in place that have been doing this for now 6 weeks. And when she says we don't know how much vaccine they might be getting, we don't know, of course, how they don't even know how to plan, we're really running into some real difficulties here. And the question I've raised is, why can't we keep track of this? As one commentator put it, we have just 2 companies right now manufacturing the vaccine. You can't tell me there isn't at least one person at Moderna or one person at Pfizer who doesn't know how many doses each company has manufactured. We've been talking about the fact that they even have chips on the packages, not in the vaccine, which people always misinterpret, but, you know, we have other packages, UPC codes, we have radio frequency identification chips, all sorts of things to track packages. If I order something from Amazon, I know where it is. I know where it is in the particular transit. When it's delivered, I can actually go on my phone and see a picture of it at my front door. And you say we can't do any of this? And then we have these difficulties in which we have individuals honestly saying that they have run out of vaccine. The governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo, says we've run out of vaccine, yet according to the chart for Bloomberg, it says they've just used 61% of the nearly 2.4 million allocated doses. And as I shared with you just the other day, good news for, say, North Dakota and West Virginia, who have done the best at getting those vaccines in the arms of individuals. Bad news for those of you in places like California and Alabama that are at the very bottom of the list, and your state, if it's not one of those 4, is somewhere in between. And so this is a question people have been asking. Another one that people have been asking about is, why can't we actually deliver the vaccine 7 days a week? I recognize that our medical personnel may be exhausted. They may be somewhat burned out, but we can find other people that can administer an injection, I would say. And if you look at the numbers from the first week in January, we had 795,000 people that were vaccinated on Saturday and only 44,000 on Sunday. As one wag said, who's running all this? Chick-fil-A? Which is a joke, but actually some people said if it was Chick-fil-A, they'd probably be have long lines, but they'd be running them very quickly, and they'd be very cheery as they were administering those vaccines. And it just, I think, illustrates again something that many people are starting to express real concern about. And at a time when we are trying to get vaccines into more people and everybody's kind of searching for a way to actually get the vaccine. After all, we've had people even calling in here saying, been trying to get on the website to get an appointment and the website crashed. I was trying to call and make an appointment, but the phone lines are busy and people are kind of searching for some way to maybe get the vaccine. Some people said it's like hunting for that golden Willy Wonka ticket, And so in the midst of all this, for those of you that will be watching the Super Bowl in less than 2 weeks, and there'll be a lot of people I suspect won't, but if you do, you notice that the Budweiser Clydesdales will not be there. Anheuser-Busch instead has said that they're going to devote their time instead to having a commercial, to spending money to actually have vaccine awareness and an education program. And I recognize there are some people that are hesitant about taking the vaccine, understand that, and that is certainly the case. But it is amazing to me that here they're going to spend that kind of money and that amount of time. And now there are Wall Street Journal reporting that there are other industries and business leaders and others trying to come up with various kinds of ways to get this to happen. And sometimes they've even had difficulty. This one comes out of Oregon, which makes me laugh, about some of these doctors that are saying, you know what, I don't think I'm going to get vaccinated. So administrators have been dangling everything from free breakfasts at Waffle House to a raffle for a car to get their employees to roll up their sleeves and take the vaccine. So it is amazing that at a time when we are trying to get more vaccines out and the bureaucracy seems to be slowing up, in a time when so many people that want to get the vaccine can't, then we're going to have a vaccine education program to finally encourage people to get a vaccine that some won't even possibly get a chance of getting until March or April. This is the world that we find ourselves in, so we'll continue covering some of those issues. And Andy, I appreciate your question. It's a good one, and maybe we can answer that in the future. But that's all we have for today. We've posted a couple of articles, as I mentioned just a minute ago, ones that relate to the conversation we've had with Robert George and also with Rachel Bovard, but we also have some others dealing with some of these other executive orders that are having an impact in our society and an impact in our world. So we'll keep covering those here at Point of View. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Lee, look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.